The murder of Kacie Woody stands as a devastating reminder of the dangers lurking in the shadows of the digital world. Kacie, a 13-year-old girl from rural Arkansas, was a bright, bubbly teenager adored by her friends and family. In December 2002, her life was cut tragically short in an event that shocked her community and sent ripples across the world. What makes Kacie's story particularly chilling is the role that the internet played in her demise. This is not just a story of a crime, but also a cautionary tale of trust, vulnerability, and the sinister predators who exploit modern technology. Kacie Renee Woody lived in Greenbrier, Arkansas, a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else. She was a middle school student who loved music, spent time with her friends, and was especially close to her father, Rick Woody. A single father, Rick worked as a local police officer, balancing his demanding job with raising Kacie and her older brother Tim. Kacie was known for her kind heart and a streak of teenage mischief. She loved spending time online, chatting with friends and exploring a new world of connections that the internet offered. But as is often the case, the things that brought her joy would ultimately lead to tragedy. In the spring of 2002, Kacie began chatting with someone she believed was a teenage boy named Dave Fagan from California. Dave presented himself as a 17-year-old who shared Kacie's interests in music and life struggles. Over the months, their conversations deepened. Dave became someone Kacie trusted implicitly, often confiding in him about her feelings, dreams, and fears. Unbeknownst to Kacie, Dave Fagan was not a teenager. In reality, he was David Leslie Fuller, a 47-year-old man from California with a sinister history. Fuller, a divorced father and registered nurse, had a pattern of grooming young girls online. He would create fake personas to lure them into trusting him. In Kacie, he saw an easy target, an innocent girl from a small town, navigating the internet without fully understanding its dangers. As their relationship progressed, David Fuller began pushing boundaries. He started asking for personal details, including Kacie's home address and schedule. Kacie, feeling secure in her friendship with Dave, shared more than she should have. She believed he was her age and could never fathom the reality of his true identity. David Fuller meticulously planned his actions. In early December 2002, he rented a car, purchased duct tape, handcuffs, and other supplies, and drove over 1,000 miles from California to Arkansas. His intention was clear: to abduct Kacie and fulfill his twisted fantasies. December 3, 2002 began like any other school day for 13-year-old Kacie Woody. The middle schooler had spent the day attending classes in her small hometown of Greenbrier, Arkansas. She joked with her friends during lunch, shared stories about her weekend, and likely hummed her favorite songs as she packed her bag to head home. Kacie lived in a modest home with her father, Rick Woody, and her older brother, Tim. Her father, a devoted police officer, worked tirelessly to provide for his children after the tragic loss of his wife in a car accident years earlier. That night, Rick had planned to attend a church service. Kacie would be home alone for a few hours, a common occurrence in their safe, rural community. Kacie planned to spend her evening doing what most teens did in 2002, chatting with friends online and listening to music. She logged into her AOL Instant Messenger account and began typing messages to her close circle of friends. Among those she spoke to was Dave, a boy she believed to be a 17-year-old from California. Their conversations had become a nightly ritual, a secret she kept from most of her friends and family. Unbeknownst to Kacie, the person she knew as Dave Fagan was watching her house. David Leslie Fuller had arrived in Greenbrier days earlier, renting a silver Dodge Caravan to blend into the small town. He had methodically planned every detail of his trip, driving over 1,600 miles from his home in California with a sinister purpose: to abduct Kacie Woody. Fuller was no stranger to predatory behavior. He had spent months grooming Kacie, carefully constructing a false persona to win her trust. His fixation on her had grown obsessive, and he decided to take the ultimate step, traveling across the country to meet her in person. The days leading up to December 3rd had been spent in reconnaissance. Fuller had parked near Kacie's home, observing her routines and familiarizing himself with the area. He even scoped out the local storage unit he had rented in Conway, a neighboring town, as a place to take her. That night, Fuller was ready to act. Around 8:30 p.m., Kacie was home alone, chatting with Dave and another friend online. Fuller, parked nearby, waited for the lights in the house to dim, signaling that Kacie was no longer preoccupied. Using the information Kacie had unknowingly shared over weeks of conversations, Fuller devised a plan to lure her outside. Kacie's father, Rick, had left a spare key hidden outside the home, a precaution he thought was harmless in their tight-knit community. Fuller found the key and let himself into the house quietly. He waited, biding his time, while Kacie continued typing away on her computer. Moments later, a friend messaged her, but Kacie stopped responding. This pause in her online activity marked the beginning of her abduction. At some point between 9 o'clock and 10 p.m., Fuller made his move. It's unclear whether Kacie was coerced to leave her home willingly or if Fuller physically forced her out. Evidence later suggested he may have used a ruse, possibly posing as a delivery driver or a friend of Dave to gain her trust. Either way, Kacie left her house with Fuller. Fuller shoved Kacie into the rented minivan, restraining her with duct tape and handcuffs he had brought along for this purpose. Kacie likely realized the horrifying truth by this point. The person she thought was her friend, Dave, was a much older man who had been deceiving her all along. The drive to the storage unit was short but harrowing. Fuller drove to Conway, a town about 20 miles from Greenbrier. The storage unit he had rented was in a secluded area, surrounded by dark fields and distant highways. The night air was bitterly cold, amplifying the eerie silence of the rural landscape. Inside the van, Kacie's terror must have been unimaginable. Fuller was not the teenage boy she had confided in. He was a middle-aged stranger, intent on causing her harm. As he drove, he likely issued threats to keep her quiet, knowing that any noise or resistance could draw unwanted attention. When Fuller arrived at the storage facility, he parked the van just outside the unit he had reserved. The unit was a dark, windowless box, cold from the December chill. It was a place devoid of humanity, chosen specifically for its isolation and the privacy it offered. Fuller dragged Kacie inside. Investigators would later find evidence that suggested a violent struggle occurred within the confines of the unit. Fuller's actions in those moments were monstrous. Details from the autopsy revealed that Kacie had been restrained and subjected to unimaginable trauma. Fuller's fantasies, fueled by months of online grooming, had turned into a horrific reality. While Fuller carried out his heinous acts, the world outside remained oblivious. The storage facility was deserted, and the quiet Arkansas night offered no witnesses. Back in Greenbrier, Kacie's father returned home to find the house eerily quiet. He called out for Kacie but received no response. Rick immediately noticed that something was wrong. The door was ajar, the spare key missing, and Kacie's computer screen still displayed her chat log. Panic set in as Rick began calling her phone, but there was no answer. Knowing his daughter's trusting nature and the dangers he had seen as a police officer, Rick feared the worst. As the hours ticked by, law enforcement began piecing together the clues that would lead them to Fuller. By the time they arrived at the storage unit the following day, it was too late. Fuller, knowing the authorities were closing in, had killed Kacie and turned the gun on himself. He was found slumped over, the weapon still in his hand. Kacie's body was discovered inside the unit. The brutality of her final moments was a haunting testament to the evil she had encountered. Her life, so full of promise and joy, had been extinguished in a place of cold, inhuman darkness. When Rick Woody returned home that evening and found Kacie missing, he immediately contacted the police. As a law enforcement officer, Rick knew the importance of swift action. A missing person report was filed, and the search for Kacie began. Friends and family frantically called her phone, but there was no answer. Investigators quickly turned their attention to Kacie's online activities. Her computer revealed the chats with Dave and the extent of their relationship. Authorities were alarmed to discover that Dave was not who he claimed to be, and that Kacie might have been lured away by a predator. Using digital forensics, investigators traced Fuller's online activity and discovered his real identity. They also identified the car he had rented and tracked it to the storage unit. On December 4, 2002, law enforcement officers stormed the unit, hoping to rescue Kacie. What they found was devastating. Kacie's lifeless body was discovered inside the unit. Fuller, knowing his capture was imminent, had killed her and then turned the gun on himself, dying by suicide. The small town of Greenbrier was left reeling from the news. A vibrant young girl, full of promise, had been taken in the most horrific way. Kacie's death was a wake-up call to parents, educators, and law enforcement about the dangers of online predators. The tragedy highlighted the importance of internet safety, particularly for children and teenagers who might not understand the risks of sharing personal information with strangers. In the years following her death, Kacie's family worked tirelessly to raise awareness about online safety. The Kacie Woody Foundation was established to educate young people about the risks of internet predators and to advocate for stronger safeguards. The murder of Kacie Woody is a painful reminder of how the anonymity of the internet can provide a hunting ground for predators. Her story underscores the need for vigilance in monitoring children's online activities and educating them about the potential dangers. For those who knew and loved Kacie, her memory remains a source of both sorrow and inspiration. The loss of Kacie Woody will forever be a scar on the heart of her community. But her story, tragic as it is, serves as a beacon to protect others from falling into the same traps. Through education, awareness, and open communication, the hope is that no other family will have to endure the pain that Kacie's family experienced. In the end, her life, though tragically short, carries a powerful message. We must be ever watchful, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable among us.